Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, July 6th, 2026. I'm your host, Eric White, filling in for Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the administration's new AI framework includes something the government hasn't had before, a chance to see advanced systems before they're released to the public. Plus, if AI starts doing the work, can people trust the outcome? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Defense contractors face a new restriction. A new law now prohibits the Pentagon from contracting with companies that retain consultants lobbying for certain Chinese firms blacklisted by the department. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Covington's election and political law lawyer, Zachary Parks.
This law is a big deal. It became effective yesterday. It prohibits the Department of War from entering into government contracts with any entity that contracts with a consulting firm or other firm that engages in what they call lobbying activities for a Chinese military company client. So in other words, the government is saying that if your firm is hiring a consultant that is helping Chinese military companies engage in lobbying, we, the government, don't want to do business with your firm.
So the lawmakers sent a letter to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying that the Defense Department should, A, ensure that the ban applies both to prospective and current clients, and they also said that the department's contractors should be encouraged to consider the full definition of lobbying activities. In the absence of rulemaking, which we will talk about, what does it say about this provision and kind of the challenges that contractors will have complying with this law now that it's in effect?
Right. Yeah, the definition of lobbying activities is very broad. It captures not just kind of standard classic DC lobbying firms, but could sweep in PR firms or consulting shops or trade associations or law firms or other consultants. Any consultant that engages in lobbying activities is potentially covered. And lobbying activities means not just reaching out to the government, communicating with government, but it can also include behind the scenes advice to clients about how they can influence U.S. policy. Contractors are now going to need to reach out to all of their consultants and obtain some sort of certification or confirmation that those consultants don't engage in lobbying activities work for companies that are listed on the Chinese military company list. So there's going to be added diligence that's going to be required for defense contractors when they engage a new consultant and when they're working with existing consultants to make sure those existing consultants are not doing covered work for Chinese military companies.
Now that the law is in effect, have you seen clients coming to you in the weeks or months prior and asking, what is this new requirement and how do I comply?
Yeah, a lot of defense contractors are grappling with this issue right now. And a lot of companies do business with the Department of Defense that you might not normally think of as defense contractors. And so a lot of companies are thinking through what they need to do, what sort of certifications they need from their consultants to ensure that they're in compliance with these rules.
And I think the issue has been that it's not widely publicized, and so contractors might not even be aware that this is now in place. What would you suggest contractors do now that the law is in effect?
Yeah, so that's very true. There hasn't been a lot of attention on the law. I would suggest that contractors do three things. First, they check their consultants to see if their consultants are registered for any Chinese military companies in the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Database and the Foreign Agents Registration Act database. That's a good step, but it's not sufficient because, again, consultants can still trigger this rule even if they're doing behind the scenes work that doesn't trigger these disclosure requirements. And so that's item number one, is to check the databases. Item number two would be obtain certifications from outside consultants, especially those consultants that might be the type of consultants that would be providing lobbying activities to confirm that they're not doing covered work for Chinese military companies. And then 3, change your kind of standard consulting agreements to include provisions in there regarding whether consultants have Chinese military company clients.
The Defense Department has this list. They really expanded it this year. They just published it in June. They added dozens of companies, but this list changes every year. How frequently should contractors reevaluate their relationships, given that this list changes pretty often? And then how should companies approach consulting or law firms with large client portfolios?
Right. So government contractors should continually kind of reevaluate this as the list is updated to make sure that their consultants are not doing business with companies that are newly added to the list. At least they're not doing lobbying activities business for those companies. And it is very common in DC and in the country for outside consultants to have lots of different clients. And so like law firms, like public affairs firms. And so it's important for defense contractors to ensure that those firms that they're using are aware of these restrictions and have processes in place to comply with them.
The law required the Defense Department to issue a DFARS rule, but they're very much behind on it. How can DoD enforce it before the rule is finalized?
Right. We don't know. In theory, the DoD could continue to enforce the statute. The statute already itself prohibits DoD from entering into contracts with defense contractors that engage in a consulting firm that works for one of these companies. So they could begin to enforce it effective immediately just by simply not entering into contracts with covered consulting firm defense contractors. So it's possible that it could be enforced effective immediately, but we're still waiting on the rules and the regulations in terms of how enforcement will look and how DoD will interpret these restrictions. Those rules could come out by July 15th, but we don't know if they'll be delayed further.
Zachary Parks is Covington's election and political law lawyer, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis there. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Still to come, if AI starts doing the work, can people trust the outcome? It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High-Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure, cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure, serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Back here on the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Agentic AI systems promise faster, cheaper execution for federal agencies, but they also raise new questions about governance, accountability, and trust. Federal Drive host Terry Gerton talked through what has to change as these systems scale with Kareem Fidel, Vice President of CGI Federal.
We have heard a lot and we talk a lot here about AI in government, but you want to bring us around to agentic AI and specifically systems that are framed as something different. What is the modern state of agentic AI and what can it do that regular AI tools can't?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is this, and it's important and helpful for us to think about how we've used Gen AI to date since it's become mainstream. And we've interacted with the chatbots, we've asked questions, we've done research, we've looked at travel itineraries or interacted in that kind of way, analyzing a document, drafting a response. And those things are incredibly helpful. The next step and the next evolution of AI is agentic AI, where systems or agents have autonomy and they can reason, they can act, and they can perform tasks, and they can hand off to another agent across the workflow. And so that's the real difference in evolution from traditional LLMs, and where it becomes very interesting is when you talk about multiple agents working in concert, performing a series of tasks and handing off to one another, and the level of efficiency and productivity becomes very interesting at that point.
Where are you seeing that being deployed in federal agencies right now? Just not as pilots, but maybe full-scale deployment.
Yeah, and I'd like to bifurcate the answer. There's agency adoption, to be sure, and then there's industry adoption to perform work on behalf of agencies. And so I'll try to frame the response in that context. So there are a couple concrete examples. One's at HUD, where we have deployed agents in our call centers on behalf of tenant interactions, so that when a tenant calls into the contact center, agents record and transcribe those calls, and then there's a dashboard that sort of collects and displays all the data and categorizes that data in a way where we can see maintenance requests or rent discrepancies, discrimination complaints. And what becomes very interesting is we can start to understand through language and tone analysis the sentiment of the user. And that's very helpful for a call center representative to improve their interaction with a citizen, to be more compassionate and to show more empathy with the understanding of what's going on behind the scenes, juxtaposing a lot of data. And that's where agentic AI is helpful in that interaction. Another cool example is with NASA. So the Artemis 2 flight readiness assessment was supported by agents that synthesized a huge amount of complex technical documentation and mission data. And so those are two examples of agencies adopting agentic AI and deploying them in production. The other side of the coin is where industry is becoming smarter on agentic AI and the tooling that we're using and incorporating that tooling on behalf of work that we perform for the government. Okay. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. Imagine a systems integrator takes over a contract from another contractor and is presented with a number of systems. Well, using AI tooling, we can obtain a picture of those systems, from documentation to dependencies to integration and interface points, much more rapidly than we could before using AI. And then another example is after we've taken over those systems, we now, through agentic AI, can perform traditional O&M tasks or software development or enhancements or modifications using agentic AI in the SDLC. And that creates significant productivity gains. So those are two sides of the coin.
Kareem Fadel is Vice President of CGI Federal. Mr. Fadel, I want to go back to the word that you used earlier, autonomy. So when we have agents, autonomous agents that are working in the background here, and say they start talking to each other, what happens in government programs when agentic AI becomes multi-agent agentic AI?
Well, the value is unlocked. And when you have multiple agents that are orchestrated, it's the combination of those agents and the tasks they're performing that really unlocks the value. Let's take an acquisition example where there's a number of documents, processing, evaluation, down selection that occurs. One agent doing one task is certainly valuable, but multiple agents across the workflow really unlocks the value.
You know, public trust in government is sort of at an all-time low. If the public finds out that agents and not people are doing all of this work behind the scenes, is your prediction that trust will go up or down?
It's really important that no matter the deployment, no matter the number of agents, no matter the AI that's being deployed, whether on the government side or the industry side, that there's a human in the loop to maintain verification and validation and to maintain that trust, because if that trust is degraded, then the interaction between citizens and government will also be degraded.
And so I assume that gets you to a conversation about governance. What is your approach to governance around these multi-AI agent systems?
So obviously, we incorporate standards like the NIST AI RMF and others into any sort of governance conversation that we have. And when we think about agentic AI, governance becomes more complex and has to scale to accommodate the number of agents that an agency is deploying. And so governance deployed in parallel with agentic AI adoption becomes increasingly important, both from a security standpoint and a cost standpoint. For example, we need to monitor token usage so that agencies understand their total cost of ownership. There may be efficiencies gained, there may be productivity enhancements, but if the total cost of ownership, if we lose sight of that, then the cost might outweigh the value and the benefit.
One of the ways I've heard AI governance described is broad streets and high curbs, so that there's lots of room for AI to maneuver, but pretty high guardrails to make sure that it doesn't go outside its boundaries. When you think about multi-agent systems, what gets harder in governance as you try to scale them maybe across agencies?
Yeah, well, I think about data boundaries in response to that question, and ensuring that agents perform tasks that they are intended to perform inside the boundary where they're intended to work. And so autonomy becomes increasingly risky when we think about AI and agents, and it's inherent, it's incumbent rather upon us to establish a government framework that puts those guardrails in place so that the tasks that the agents are intended to perform are performed.
The capacity that you talk about is got to be very tempting to agency leaders, right? They're stressed in terms of resources, they're stressed in terms of staffing. And so deploying agents, especially multi-agent systems, on big problems has got to be tempting. What should agency leaders make sure that they are keeping front of mind as they're considering where to deploy these kinds of multi-agent system tools?
Well, the fascinating aspect of this is that there is an opportunity here to dramatically, materially, or significantly, depending on the deployment scale, reduce O&M costs and use those funds that are freed up as a result for modernization or transformation initiatives to enhance citizen services. And so while there are a number of aspects to think about as it relates to deployment, that's one that's most fascinating to me, that this paradigm has now shifted, and now we have an opportunity and the technology to free up funds to achieve objectives that we weren't able to before.
Tell me more about that. Have you seen it in the examples you gave us earlier? Has the cost curve actually shifted so that they are freeing up more money, or are we still in the spending more money stage?
So there was a report by McKinsey released last week or the week before, where that analyst group was talking about 50% productivity or efficiency gains, and it depends on which lens you're looking through. But the gains now are real. The benchmarks are solid. And so now it's about looking at the mission and the objectives of an agency and understanding where the technology can be deployed to realize that value.
And what is changing for the federal workforce as these kinds of models roll out?
So this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. And I think about the answer to that question, both in terms of the federal workforce, but the workforce at large. I was at Georgetown University yesterday talking to a group of high school students that were taking a week-long AI course at Georgetown. And first of all, how cool is that? I had the opportunity to talk to the future of the workforce on a topic that is incredibly germane to all of us. When I think about them graduating, college, not high school, but college, and I can't even imagine what the workforce is going to look like when they retire. But they're graduating into a hybrid workforce where humans and AI are working together to perform tasks and achieve missions. And that's a different operating model. That requires different roles, different managerial techniques, different leadership behaviors, and certainly introduces different risks. This is emerging, but it's an exciting time for us to emerge into a new model where we can be more productive.
Kareem Fidel is Vice President of CGI Federal. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, we get an update on everything going on Capitol Hill at the moment. But first, the administration's new AI framework includes something the government hasn't had before, a chance to see advanced systems before they're released to the public. It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. A new executive order sets up a pathway for companies to share advanced artificial intelligence models with federal officials ahead of public release, giving the government earlier visibility into emerging capabilities and the risks that they could pose. Joining the Federal Drive earlier to explain how this is playing out was Alex Hastings, a partner at Morgan Lewis.
It has been a little over a month since the executive order promoting advanced artificial intelligence, innovation, and security was released. So now that folks have had some time to live with it, what is this EO really doing? What do you think the key takeaways are from this executive order?
So Terry, the EO really does two things, and it's a really interesting development, and I think it's good both for the government as well as for industry. The EO does first, it creates a foundation for an AI cybersecurity clearinghouse for the assessment of frontier AI models. And the other thing it does, which isn't getting as much attention, but I think is equally important, is it directs executive agencies to assess and continue to the development of AI capabilities for government use and critical infrastructure operators. So think about rural hospitals, community banks, local utilities, things like that.
For a long time, the government approached technology by regulating it after the fact. This executive order tends to lean in the other direction, working with companies while the technology is still being developed. What do you think changed that made this earlier, closer collaboration feel necessary?
Well, talking to people in industry, it's a welcome change, and it's a change that I think needed to happen and potentially not soon enough because, as tech is being developed and as tech changes, the development changes quickly. And, companies are interested in getting to market, getting to business, getting to consumers, and meeting the demand. And, as regulatory attorneys, regulatory policymakers know well, sometimes regulations can't keep up with that as hard as they may try. And so by taking this approach where, regulation may come, after the fact, it helps to ensure that, government is collaborating with industry, is being kept informed, is working with industry, but allows tech companies to continue to develop and go to market at speed.
So the order sets up this voluntary framework for working with companies who are developing these frontier models, and it has the idea that companies will provide the government access to those models before they're released. How do you see that actually playing out on the ground?
So there's a lot of considerations, I think, that and questions that the executive order leaves open as to how this will play out in practice. One of those questions, or several of those questions, include, how companies are going to structure their collaborations with the government, including confidentiality considerations, cybersecurity considerations, if they're providing their frontier models to the government, insider risk, intellectual property is another one. All of these are issues that I think before any model is shared with the government or any collaboration occurs, need to be thought through by a developer. They're solvable issues, to be clear, but they're issues that the executive order leaves open, and I think need to be carefully considered by a developer. But once those issues are considered and agreed to with the government, there's then an opportunity to collaborate as the government looks through and considers the frontier models. And I think that, on a going forward basis, it provides an opportunity for, the government to assess these in a voluntary way, to work with industry to identify certain cybersecurity or national security threats that could be presented by certain frontier models in a way that, again, allows industry to collaborate with the government outside of, traditional regulatory models.
Alex Hastings is a partner at Morgan Lewis. So, Mr. Hastings, one of the contention points as this EO was under development was how long the government would get access to these models in advance. There was a 90-day window that is now 30 days. And you also just mentioned a lot of concern that these AI models may present in terms of national security. As complex as they are, is that 30-day window enough to identify even jointly the risks, the security risks that may be inherent here?
Yeah, I think this is an evolving framework. I think CISA and others will have to consider sort of what is possible within 30 days. It goes back to the beginning of our conversation in which, this technology is rapidly developing. And so, whereas a 90-day model may have presented certain benefits, a 30-day model allows the government to see, the frontier model at a state when it's closer to the release date. And so I think there's certain benefits to a 30-day model. And it also allows, for developers who may not have been, able or willing to agree to a 90-day model to participate in a 30-day model. So, I think there's certain trade-offs to the length of time. And I think that, the 30 days was what was able to be agreed to here.
There are a variety of groups of stakeholders that have vested interest in how this plays out. Kind of walk us through how different groups are seeing this. You've mentioned developers a couple of times. You mentioned critical infrastructure operators, even the government agencies themselves. How are all of those different interests and insights going to be able to be kept in balance as this moves forward?
I think that's important consideration because there's so many stakeholders in assessing in assessing the frontier models and considering sort of how they are going to be evaluated. I mean, as a threshold matter, considering the importance of sort of assessing these as they come to market. I mean, we've seen, already some of these AI models that are capable of red teaming at scales that, far exceed human capabilities. So there's no doubt that many of these stakeholders, whether they're developers or federal agencies or, the public, are aligned at least at some level on the importance of ensuring that there's a level of safeguarding national security in the release of these frontier models. And so the question then becomes how to evaluate them to protect that national security while also ensuring that we, safeguard the confidentiality and the intellectual property rights and the innovation of industry. And so this sort of framework that's been created, at least initially, seems to present a good baseline by which we can, explore how to do that in a voluntary way.
The critical infrastructure providers here seem to be a really unique group. In many cases, they're decentralized, could be even small operators, maybe don't have the big cyber security internal operations that would help them take on both the risks and the benefits of these frontier models. How do you see them getting involved here?
So the critical infrastructure operators are an important part of this executive order. And, to some extent, they've been lost in the discussion, and I think it's important to raise them because whether it's a rural hospital or a utility company or some other part of our critical infrastructure, they stand to benefit as well. And one of the ways that they can stand to benefit is the portion of this executive order that directs executive agencies to evaluate and assess where certain parts of AI related to cybersecurity can be opened up and made available to critical infrastructure providers, because that's a potential vulnerability or an area that could be better bolstered in our national security infrastructure. And in fact, another area of the EO that's interesting that could benefit these critical infrastructure providers is the directive in the EO that to OMB to look for federal grant funding that may be available to support AI for these providers as well. So while the frontier model collaborative process is probably the most important and sort of newsworthy portion of the EO, the support to some of these critical infrastructure operators and the opportunities it creates for them is also an important point not to be lost.
This space is moving so quickly. This EO seems to be flexible with some guidance, but let's just say a year down the road, what would you hope to see that would be different in how the government and industry relate to each other around these frontier models that would give you the indication that this framework has been effective?
A year from now, it would be great to see clear implementing guidance, particularly for industry and for the agencies in how this collaboration for these frontier models will work. The guidance would hopefully include how agencies would evaluate and how developers could provide access to their models. Hopefully the guidance would, and this is true for every EO, right? They're somewhat open-ended. They look to the agencies to implement. And so, this is not an exception, but hopefully the guidance would provide input on and directive on how developers' intellectual property would be protected, what criteria agencies would use to assess the potential national security risk of frontier models. Essentially things of that nature that could actually give some additional sort of structure to this collaborative model that the EO establishes. That would be the direction. If this were to move forward in a successful direction, that would be helpful.
Alex Hastings is a partner at Morgan Lewis. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Still to come, we get an update on everything going on Capitol Hill at the moment. It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Congress was sort of stuck in a wait-and-see mode once the president demanded more attention was directed at passing his election security legislation, an effort that, again, was thwarted by procedural rules in the Senate. Joining me to explain how things went down and what to watch for after their brief recess next week, Bloomberg Government Deputy News Director Lauren Duggan. Lauren, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't we just start off with the main recap of everything that happened in Congress last week as it pertains to really anything.
Well, I mean, it was a short week for the House. They were due to be in for 4 days, left after 2, and that's because they couldn't move the business that they had intended to on the floor last week, which was supposed to include the National Defense Authorization Act, a major bill that they try to do every year, but they couldn't get enough support within the Republican conference to move that onto the floor, in large part, but not only because of the Save America Act, this election administration legislation that Donald Trump and his Republican allies really want to advance. And that's kind of been overshadowing business the last couple of weeks and will continue to do so, I'm sure, when they come back after their July 4th break.
Yeah, it keeps on coming back. They even had bipartisan housing bill that had passed, and the president had said, no, I'm still sticking to the Save America Act. What is going to be the end of all this? I'm sure you don't really know, but is the Save America Act not going to ever get passed until there's a change in the numbers, or is the president just kind of hoping he can outwait Congress in getting anything done until it is passed?
Signs point to no on that. I mean, you can never predict the future, right? But the challenge here has been the math in the Senate and whether there are enough votes to get that over the line with the current rules that the Senate operates under. Maybe there's a bare majority support, but it would take, 60 votes to overcome a filibuster and get cloture in most cases. Some people want to change the filibuster procedure, blow it up. Donald Trump has called for getting rid of the filibuster on this to try and get it through. That's unlikely to happen. Alternative plan that's been floated is to use the budget reconciliation process, which allows Congress to pass things through both chambers with simple majority votes, but it has to be tailored to the budget and tied to fiscal matters, and it's kind of hard to do that with those rules and what the Save America Act would be, which is just to remind your listeners, is about voter ID when you show up at the polls. It's about proof of citizenship when you register to vote, and a version that Donald Trump wants would restrict mail-in balloting as well. That has been cooler received on the Hill than the first two elements of that. So it seems unlikely that those paths are going to open up, and what House members are saying is, no, we should attach it to every must-pass bill we send over to the Senate so that they have to deal with this some way or somehow over the course of the year. But there's some opposition to this, and it's hard to see what that path is to get the president where he wants to on that piece of legislation.
In the meantime, what does that mean for the defense budget and the NDAA? Do they have a necessary timeline that they need to operate by? Because it's a massive budget, and defense leaders have always complained about not having a good direction list when it comes to getting the NDAA and all the budgetary items. What does that mean for them while they sit around and wait for this to get passed?
Defense budgeting has been a bigger question this year just in general because of the amount the president requested, $1.5 trillion for the next fiscal year, and that's taken place in different legislation. So the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the bill that stalled last week, is setting policy for the department, reflects $1.15 trillion of that, which is the core discretionary part. There's also interest in passing $350 billion through budget reconciliation. That bill I talked about might be a vehicle for both of those things, but there are challenges with that as well, including time. And then there's the actual appropriations process that has to play out. Something needs to happen there by October 1st to ensure the government stays open. And then add to that, there's a request for supplemental funding to cover some of the expenses related to the Iran war and other needs that the administration has identified. So there's these 4 bills out there. They can't really move on any of them right now. They were stalled last week heading into this recess, and time's going to be the biggest obstacle. The House is only supposed to be here for 2 weeks in July, maybe the Senate for 4, a little window in September, and a little window after the elections is all that's on the books right now. They could change schedules, of course, but time is going to be a major component in trying to get any of this done.
We're speaking here with Lauren Duggan from Bloomberg Government. And yeah, for the folks like you and I who cover this kind of stuff, it's almost like we're in an audience of a boxing match and we're going around going, who you got? Instead, it's, do you think there's going to be shutdown? So let me put that question to you. What are the likelihood of that happening? As you know, it's an election year. There's going to be even more turmoil. You can foresee a lot more stalemates on the horizon. Do you think we're heading for another one with the current attitudes and temperature check going on in the Hill right now?
You can't rule it out, and you don't know what lines in the sand are going to be drawn around what's most likely going to be a continuing resolution, not a full resolution of everything, but pulling this year's funding levels into next year to keep things operating. Probably people want to leave and go and campaign, and they can't really do that if the government's shut down, or it would be hard to do so. We'll see if either in this period in July or more likely when they come back in September, if they can get some sort of funding element done, at least to get them through the election, and then maybe see how the elections shake out and what to do there. But, there's a non-zero chance of a shutdown, as we would say, just because there's not a clear path on these things. And even getting simple things or routine things to the floor has proven difficult the last few weeks.
That's a very good political answer. You should run for office yourself, I think. And with it being an election year, is that why even some members of the president's own party are a little wary of the Save America Act, just because their campaign strategies are probably set at this point, right? And if you change the rules of the game so close to the actual date, they'll have to shift and, all of a sudden focus more on, getting more people registered, making sure that even their voters are qualified to vote. I mean, is that kind of what the drawback is in their eyes?
In some ways, some people don't want to change Senate rules because they like the way the institution operates, and there doesn't seem to have been the support there for that, which that's kind of more of an institutionalist perspective. But at some point, it's going to get potentially too close to the election to actually make some of these changes that they would need to make. But we'll see if that factors in, especially if this doesn't get done and remains a live issue. There are some senators who would give up campaign time, by the way, to spend every day here trying to debate that piece of legislation to get it over the line. Senator Mike Lee was making a lot of calls for that. For example, he's a Republican from Utah. But election year politics do tend to creep up in a lot of these discussions. And really, you have to look at the narrow margins in both chambers. If some of the things that were hiccups for the House had much smaller people, this had about a dozen or so Republicans that were standing in the way of moving forward last week. Not just because of Save America, some other things as well. But yeah, the election is kind of an ever-present thought in a lot of people's minds.
With both chambers out next week, any dates that we should be on the lookout for coming to mind other than those obvious budget deadlines? Are there any other sort of hearings that we'll need to be on the lookout for, or what have you all set for your editorial agenda?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what they can get done in this July work period, and nominations are also going to be there. Todd Blanche for Attorney General and a new pick for Labor Secretary Sonderling. See if they can get hearings and get through the Senate. The president will want to get as many nominees as he can between now and the end of the year on the chance that maybe he doesn't have control control of the Senate or has an even narrower margin there if Democrats make inroads. So nominations will be a big thing, government funding top of mind, and all these other things they'd like to get done before the end of the year, including things like crypto regulation, which has been a big priority for members. There's no deadline around that, but there's a lot of push to try and do something.
Lauren Duggan, Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government, thank you as always.
Thank you.
And you can find this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive and also wherever you get your podcasts. The Office of Personnel Management wants to make it easier to remove federal employees for performance or misconduct reasons. In a new 81-page proposed rule that came out last week, OPM and the Merit Systems Protection Board are jointly seeking to change the administrative procedures used to fire employees and the review of such actions before the board. For more on the proposed changes, Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller joins me now to discuss. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, Eric.
So what are OPM and MSP proposing to change now in how agencies can fire employees for performance or misconduct? This is among the many changes that we've seen when it comes to this topic over the last couple of years.
Oh, yes. OPM has been busy over the last year and a half. But this one is a very big deal for federal employees. We've heard for years, Eric, hey, it's just too hard to fire people. Hey, when we have a performance issue, hey, when there's misconduct, it goes on and on and on, and it's hard to fire people. And Eric, I've talked to plenty of chief human capital officers over the last 15, 20 years, and they say, well, it's actually not. You can if you want to go through the process, and sometimes that process can be very difficult. So OPM is saying, let's make the process simpler, or let's make it less complex. So there's three major changes. I'll go through each of them very quickly. The first one, very simple. Let's give managers and supervisors more training around how to deal with employees with performance or misconduct issues. So currently, what they're proposing is they're going to reduce the intervals of training for supervisors and executive positions from once every 3 years to annually. This way, they're ensuring the personnel are well-versed in the actions, options, strategies to oversee and manage productivity of their workforces. It also modifies what they said 4 existing subjects and adds 8 new subjects that agencies will have to incorporate into their annual trainings. So stuff like probationary trial periods, awards and bonuses, addressing reports of hostile work environment, retaliation, or harassment, as an example. The second big change, and I think this is significant, they want to limit the performance improvement plans, or commonly known as PIPs, to 30 calendar days. And our calendar days is key here versus work days. So, once you get put on a PIP, you have 30 days to show improvement. OPM also wants to no longer allow what they call pre-PIPs. This idea of, hey, Eric, before we actually put you on a performance improvement plan, we're going to put you on a pre-performance improvement plan. They're saying, hey, that just adds more complexity. And it also, because managers tend to be risk averse, they, kind of dissuades them from initiating the removal procedures. And the idea behind this is really to say, hey, you have 30 days to fix or you're out. And I think that really puts people on the clock and then really pushes them toward improving or knowing that their time is short. The third one really focuses on MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board. And what their proposal is asking to do is really say, hey, we're going to no longer make the Douglas factors a requirement. Now, these are 12 considerations agencies should use in every adverse action case. Now, they're not mandated, they're not required by statute or law, but there's something, the Douglas factors have been in place since 1981, and really they've been upheld by the circuit court and other courts over the last 45 years. But OPM and MSPB says, hey, agencies sometimes follow it too rigidly. They're not using their best decisions, and they're saying, okay, does it meet any of these or all of these 12 factors before they can actually take action? Scott Cooper, the OPM director, called them very mechanical. They talk about them being checkboxes instead of looking at the totality of circumstances. And I think the goal here is to say, hey, instead of these Douglas factors, we're going to ask agencies to really look at them based on assessing whether or not the chosen penalty makes sense. So I think that is another big change. So 3 big changes. It's a 81-page rule. Folks can read it. We have a link to it on federalnewsnetwork.com.
Interesting. Did Cooper or anybody else from the administration explain why these changes are needed or important to them?
There's 2 things happening here. We've seen several executive orders and several OPM memos looking at creating a high-performance workforce. And I think this is part of that goal that the administration has laid out. They've said, hey, if there's bad performers, why do we want them working for us? And I think, most of us can agree to that, right? Most of us can say, well, we don't want to work with bad people. We don't want to promote people who don't deserve to be promoted just because they've been in their position for 6 years or 10 years or 15 years. And at the same time, if there's a discipline, if somebody is being harassing their employees, has a really bad attitude, is not showing up and doing their job, they should be able to be dismissed and moved out of the job. And I think everyone can agree to that. I think what Scott Cooper has said, and he wrote a very long blog that, again, we have linked to on federalnewsnetwork.com. And let me just take a quick aside, Eric. Full credit to Scott Cooper. A lot of times, this administration and maybe some others, but this administration puts things out without a lot of explanation or background or context. And what Scott has done, Director Cooper has done over the last year and a half is every time they put out a memo, he's put a blog post out explaining his rationale, explaining the administration's point of view, and providing some context around it. And I think that's a really super thing. As reporters, Eric, we want press releases. We want press conferences. We want to be able to ask questions. And while the blog post doesn't necessarily answer everything, it does give us a lot more context, and it gives I think the federal employees and contractors and unions more context. And what Scott Cooper said in that blog post is, listen, no manager wants to spend 6, 12, or even 18 months trying to manage out an underperforming employee. He goes, that's what the old process has been inefficient, too complicated, and we have to change that. You want to be able to move out more quickly. You want to say you have to recognize that these employees need help. If they can't change it or if they're not getting help, then either they need to leave or they need to fix what the problems are. And he goes, it's not just about the employees that are struggling or the employees that are in the poor fit. It's also about demotivating the better performance. If you're trying to create a high-risk culture, Scott Cooper says, then having employees who aren't carrying their weight is demotivating to everyone. So I think there's a combination of things going on here. But again, we have the full link. People can read Scott Cooper's blog post on federalnewsnetwork.com.
We're talking here with Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller. On the other side of that, what has been the reaction so far? Was everybody else as satisfied with Cooper's explainer as you were?
No surprise, there's a lot of concern about these changes. And again, they are proposed changes. OPM is accepting comments for the next 30 days. We're probably at about 25 days now. And I imagine they will get a lot of comments, probably thousands of comments. I heard from two specific people. The American Federation of Government Employees, AFGE, their president, Everett Kelly, put a statement out saying the proposed rule would unravel nearly 50 years of established precedent. And he's talking about the Douglas factors here from the 1981 ruling. He says, listen, the rules here are here to treat employees fairly. An agency should act with impartiality and consistency when they come around to discipline. And he believes that the proposed rules would do the opposite. Kelly says that proposed rules would open the door to political or personal motivated actions while undermining the integrity of the nonpartisan civil service. I also spoke with Raymond Limon, the former MSPB vice chairman. He was an appointee during the Joe Biden administration. Limon retired in 2025. And he pointed out two things. The first thing he pointed out was it's really unusual, maybe never happened before, that OPM and MSPB would jointly issue a rule. It really does, he says, call into question the independence of the MSPB. He goes, this is a fundamental shift in in how Congress tried to strike the right balance between the agency management and independent review. He goes, and he used an example. During the Biden administration, there was a similar situation where the two organizations had similar rules that were going to follow each other, but they remained distinct and separate. This was specifically around Schedule F, where OPM issued some regulations and MSPB followed with their own set of rules or regulations in terms of how to process some of those appeals under potential Schedule F. He says this just doesn't make sense. He also talked about this idea of the Douglas factors. And again, he goes back to the idea that he believes there's a lot of people who believe the Douglas factors actually are not a checkbox exercise. They are not a complex, burdensome, formulaic application. They think they really are well regarded by the chief human capital officers, federal managers in terms of how they're used. And they've been supported by the federal court over the last 45 years several times. And the MSPB also has for 4 decades tried to correct and improve this checklist-driven approach for the Douglas factors through its own case law. So I think those are the 2 things he pointed out as kind of like, hey, these are big deals. I did talk to another third former HR executive in the federal government. This person asked for anonymity because they didn't get permission to talk to the press. But they say a couple things stood out to them. One, obviously, more training is good. They can support that. That's easy. That's an easy one. They did highlight the 30-day PIP, the idea of this idea that, limit it to 30 days. And he goes, that is a carryover from the first Trump administration, something that the first Trump administration proposed. And they believe this is an attempt to exclude this idea of the PIP and the length of the PIP from collective bargaining with unions in the future. Currently, what I've heard and what I've been told is there's nothing that says you can't do a 30-day PIP. I think a lot of agencies tend to do a longer PIP. So those are some of the reactions we're getting initially. I'm sure there'll be a lot more, especially when those comments come in.
Yeah, and as they do come in and after that period has expired, what should we be on the lookout for the next 6 months or so, if and when this is implemented indeed?
We know that the OPM will get those comments. They'll start reviewing the comments. They'll make some decisions about how to change the rule, if at all. But I think a couple things to highlight, Eric, is the numbers of comments. I think this will drive a lot of concern across the federal community, specifically among the unions. This is a big change in how the unions, I think, had always looked at protecting employees to make sure everyone is treated fairly. I think you may also see, and this is the one person, the executive I talked to on background, they said they wouldn't be surprised to see some legal challenges against this throwing out of the Douglas factors. So I think that's something to look out for. Will lawsuits be filed? We saw similar lawsuits already filed, for instance, with the non-disclosure agreement proposal that OPM put out there. So I think this may actually go to court as well to say, hey, we know this works. We have 45 years. We're not saying it's perfect, but just to throw them all out altogether really does break a lot of case law, a lot of precedents, according to the sources I've talked to. The other thing is, what's Congress going to do? How are they going to get involved? We're seeing this. A lot of members of Congress are raising the ire over the changes to the grants management, the new regulations. Once I think Congress starts hearing from their constituents, especially the local ones in Maryland, D.C., Virginia, and those with obviously a lot of federal employees in their districts, I think they may also start to get involved. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some sort of not just letters. I think the Democrats love writing letters all the time, but there may also be some push to, okay, can we put some of these things in case law in terms of the process to remove employees? Again, Eric, I think this goes back to a very simple thing. Everyone agrees that dismissing for performance or misconduct should be easier. It's how to make it easier, and I think that's where the rub is happening here.
Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller, thanks so much for providing us with that update.
Always a pleasure, Eric.
And as Jason mentioned, you can check out his reporting at federalnewsnetwork.com, along with a link to OPM Director Scott Cooper's blog post about this topic. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by me, Eric White, along with Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.